Hey, welcome back to the Cleveland Community Chapel Sunday evening service in our Old Testament studies. Hope you enjoyed the book of Amos. We've moved back to one of the historical books, the book of Samuel now, First Samuel. So we'll be in Samuel for a while here. I'm glad you can join us on chapter 1. And it's kind of a short chapter. It shouldn't take us very long here this evening, but it's the origin of Samuel to start with here in chapter 1, so let's find out where Samuel came from. He was an answer to his mama's prayer, and he was a gift from God. Chapter 1, verse 1, now there was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim, a little town, of Mount Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah. That's the only thing we really need to know. Here's the origin of the family tree of Elkanah. He was the son of Jeroboam, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, son of Zuph, and he was an Ephrathite. And Elkanah, now verse 2, he had 2 wives. That was allowed back in the Old Testament, right? Never was God's perfect plan. Jesus said that. He said Adam and Eve was the example, said he meant for 2 to be forever, but it's hard for women to take care of themselves back in that day. Wasn't a lot of opportunities unless they was a wife, so there was provisions made for people to have multiple wives sometimes. So Elkanah had 2 wives. The name of one wife was Hannah, who's a palindrome, H-A-N-N-H, spelled the same way either way. And the name of the other was Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. This is a source of conflict between the 2 wives now. This man, he went up out of his city, Elkanah did, yearly to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. So annually he went up to worship, probably Passover, and he probably took his lamb. And the reason he went to Shiloh is when the Israelites first came out of the wilderness and came into the promised land, that's the first place that the tabernacle was erected at that period of Israel's history. So the Ark of the Covenant was there, and the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, and it's about 20 miles north of Jerusalem, and that's where folks went to worship in the early time of the nation of Israel, now that they've become a nation, so to speak, instead of wanderers in the wilderness, or Hebrews, pilgrims. So Elkanah, he went up yearly to worship, middle of verse 3, and to sacrifice, which is part of that worship system, to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And the 2 sons of Eli, we're going to find out is the priest, and he had 2 boys, and just make mental note of them for future chapters, because we're going to meet these 2 lowlifes again. Eli seemed like he was a good guy, but he had a problem with his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, the priest of the Lord. They were there. And when the time was that Elkanah offered, he went to offer his lamb or whatever, he gave to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and her daughters portions which were allowed by the Leviticus, that when you bring a sacrifice, remember a portion of it was given to the priest, a portion of it for the family. It wasn't just all sacrificed to an offering here. So he gave his wife and her sons, Peninnah and her sons, and her daughters, plural in both cases here. She had a lot of children. But unto Hannah he gave a worthy portion, or also translated a double portion. For he loved Hannah. Even though she didn't have any children, he loved her and took care of her. But the Lord had shut up her womb. She couldn't have children. And her adversary, now the adversary is a name for the devil. But in this case, Hannah's adversary is her, how would you say that? The other wife in the family. So, wife-in-law, I don't know. So her adversary also provoked her sore or miserably, to make her fret or made her miserable, because the Lord had shut up her womb. It was that jealousy thing. One was jealous of the other one, and that one had kids, and she didn't like that wife because she didn't have no kids, so she was always throwing that up to her face, making life miserable to her. And as he did so year by year, verse 7, she went up to the house of the Lord. So she provoked her. Peninnah provoked Hannah. Therefore Hannah, she wept and she wouldn't eat. She did not eat. And then said Elkanah, her husband, to her, Hannah, why weepest thou? And why eatest thou not? Just gave you a double portion of this good lamb. Why aren't you eating? Why are you crying? and he tries to make things better. I imagine that, the old saying that if Mom ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. I imagine that everybody in this house is probably miserable because these two fussing and fighting all the time. But, Elkanah, he's trying to make it better. He says to her, honey, he says, ain't I better to you than 10 sons? So we didn't get Hannah's answer here, by the way. So Hannah rose up after they had eaten in Shiloh and after they had drunk. Now Eli, the priest, verse 9, he sat upon a seat by a post of the temple of the Lord. So he is in charge at this time, and people were coming and they were worshiping in the outer court, kneeling there and praying. And he was kind of keeping an eye on things. That was his job, I guess, Eli. So he pulled him up something. He sat on a post there to watch everybody, make sure everything was being done in a proper, decent, and orderly way, and that God was being honored, and people wasn't there disrespectful and that kind of thing. So he was keeping an eye on things. And he looks over here in verse 10. She was in bitterness of soul and prayed to the Lord and wept sore. So Eli looked, and here's this woman over there. She's praying. Well, that's okay so far. Hold the thought, though. And while she's praying, verse 11, Hannah, she vows a vow. She makes a promise to God. Really kind of makes a deal with God. It's a stipulatory deal. If you'll do this for me, Lord, I'll do this. She vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look upon the affliction of your handmaid and remember me, and not forget your handmaid, but will give unto thine handmaid a man child. She's praying for a baby. She said, not just any baby. She said, I want a boy baby, a man child. And if you'll do that for me, Lord, I'll dedicate him to you all the days of his life. I'll give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and there'll no razor come upon his head. In other words, he'll be so dedicated to the Lord, he'll be a Nazarite. That he won't ever drink anything from the fruit of the vine, and he will never shave his head. It's a special dedication to the Lord of the highest caliber. I'll make him your utmost servant, Lord, if you'll give me a boy. Verse 12, and it came to pass as she continued praying before the Lord that Eli marked her mouth. That means he's looking over things, and he sees this woman down here, and she's praying silently. God hears her because she's praying from the heart, but she's moving her lips at the same time, and you couldn't hear what she was saying. Eli saw her lips moving, and he thought, uh-oh, there's a drunk woman down there. Now Hannah, she spake in her heart, verse 13, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she had been drunken, which we're going to find out that Eli's boys, they've got a habit of bringing this kind of women around there anyway, and that's probably what he's looking for. He thought he was one of them. And Eli said unto her, how long wilt thou be drunken? Put away your wine from thee. And Hannah answered and said, no, my Lord, I'm a woman of a sorrowful spirit. I've drunk neither wine nor strong drink. I haven't been drinking, but I've poured out something. I poured out my soul to the Lord. I've poured out my soul before the Lord. 16, count not your handmaid for a daughter of Belial. Now, this is the term that you'll run across all through the Old Testament, usually sons of Belial. Belial would be like a name for the devil. They were sons of the devil. Or in this case, he thought she was a daughter of Belial or a daughter of the devil. I think of it this way. Don't think bad of me, but I read it, and they're SOBs. When you see people in the Bible that are labeled SOBs, sons of Belials, that means those are the worst lowlifes that you can find in the society there. And good news is, though, that as Christians we know that God can take the SOBs, the sons of Belial, and turn them into sons and daughters of God. That's what the cross of Christ does. But just so you know that when you run across that term in the Old Testament, just think about it. They're sons of Belial, SOBs. They're people that everybody says that we'd be better off without them. So Hannah says, don't count me as a daughter of Belial, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief have I spoken hitherto. I'm just praying. I'm not drunk. Sometimes God's people are thought to be drunk when they're just being spiritual, right? That happened on the day of Pentecost. Remember those guys bounced out onto the street and they were preaching and people heard them in their own language, and somebody said, these men are drunk. And Peter says, it ain't even 9 a.m. They're not drunk. They're filled with the Spirit. There is some kind of correlation there between drunks and being filled with the Spirit, though. You can go with that, but the Bible says to be not drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit. Be drunk on the Spirit of God. Then Eli answered and said, Go in peace, verse 17, and the God of Israel grant thee thy petition that they've asked him. In other words, Eli's cleared it up, and he realized, oh, she ain't drunk, she's just praying. I was mistaken. He says, go in peace, son, and I hope God answers your prayer. And she said, verse 18, Let your handmaid find grace in your sight. So the woman went her way, and she did eat, and her countenance was no more sad. She's casted her care upon the Lord because He cares for her. She's like, I've done everything I can pray, and I'm trusting the Lord, and I'm not going to walk around here being miserable. She sat down eating, her countenance was sore anymore. She says, I've turned it over to God. And sometimes everybody needs to do that. Sometimes we just hang on to something that makes us miserable, and it comes to a point that you've done everything you can do, and you just got to turn it over to God and go on with life and forget about it. Let God handle it. So, verse 19, they rose up in the morning early, and they worshiped before the Lord, and they returned, and they came to their house to Ramah, and Elkanah knew Hannah, his wife, and the Lord remembered her. When He knew her, that's like Adam knew Eve, and she conceived and bare a son. And wherefore it came to pass, when the time was come about after Hannah had conceived, that she bare a son. The answer to her prayers has come. And she called his name Samuel, saying, Because I've asked him from the Lord. And the word Samuel has something to do with this, a gift from God, or God answered my prayer. And the man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and his vow. But Hannah went not up this next time, for she said to her husband, I'm not going back to Shiloh, to the temple, to the tabernacle, until the child be weaned. And then I'll bring him that he may appear before the Lord, and there abide forever. Now, I've read back in that day, children weren't weaned till like 3 or 4 years old sometimes, so he's going to get up that big at least. And then she's going to give him to the priest there, and let them make a priest out of him too, a servant of God. So Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Do what seems good, tarry thou till you've weaned him. Only the Lord establish His word. So the woman abode and gave her son suck until she had weaned him. And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her. Now, I guess he's 3, 4, 5 years old now. And she takes him back up there with 3 bullocks, an ephah of flour, a measure of flour, and a bottle of wine. And she brought him to the house of the Lord in Shiloh. And the child was young. And they slew a bullock, and they brought the child to Eli, the priest, right? And she said, Oh, my Lord, as thy soul liveth, my Lord, I am the one. She told Eli, You've seen me before. Remember, you thought I was drunk and I was praying, and then you said, May God answer your prayer. Here's the answer. You've seen me before. I'm the woman that stood by thee here praying to the Lord. And for this child I prayed. And the Lord's given me, He's answered my prayer. He's given me my petition, which I ask of Him. Therefore also I've lent him to the Lord. She's given him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he'll be lent to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there. And we'll pick up this story here next week. It's just a good flowing story. Goes right along. Easy to follow. See you next week for chapter 2.